My name is Salar Mohandasi. I teach in the history department here at Bowdoin. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual Alfred E. Golz Lecture. In 1970, Ronald Golz, a history major who graduated from Bowdoin in 1956, established this lecture fund to honor his father, Alfred E. Golz. With the continuing support of the Golz family, every year, the history department invites an eminent historian to speak on subjects of general interest. This year, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Arne Westad of Yale University. He's a scholar of modern international history with a specialization in Eastern Asia. Professor Westad began his prolific career by exploring the international dimensions of the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s. He then drew on this work to rethink the global scope of the Cold War more broadly. Now, we commonly think of the Cold War as a tense but relatively peaceful rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. But Westad's work reminds us that it was much more than that. It was a life and death struggle between competing visions of the future. It was fought in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and it was far from cold. From there, Professor Westad embarked on a comprehensive study of China's dramatic economic reforms in the 1970s and 1980s, and now he's working on a new project on imperialism in the 19th century. At the same time, Professor Westad has turned his attention to the sweeping changes brought about by the end of the Cold War, transformations that have made possible the world we live in today. He's especially interested in the linkages between the spectacular rise of China, the fate of Russia after the collapse of the USSR, and the rivalry between the United States and the People's Republic of China. These are, of course, topics that are on many of our minds as we reflect on the world today. And they are precisely what Professor Westad will speak about tonight. So please join me in welcoming him to Bowdoin.
Thank you very much, Salah, for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure and a deep honor for me to be here to present the Alfred E. Golz Memorial Lecture. I was particularly pleased to figure out that Ron Golz provided the funding for this lecture in memory of his father. We should always appreciate what our fathers do, and this is a wonderful way of doing it. I say this with some emphasis now that I'm a grandfather, so I can see this happening several times over, if we are lucky. And if we want to move in the direction that Ron Golz did in providing the setup for this fantastic lecture. I also want to thank Bowdoin College for inviting me to do the lecture. I want to thank Salah Mohandisi, who first invited me to come. I want to thank Rebecca Banks, who's done a fantastic job in preparing this lecture and setting up all of the practicals in a really wonderful way. So it's great to be here. What I'm going to do tonight is to try to connect some of the key developments that happened in the late 20th century in preparation for the 21st century. So I'm going to talk about how the Cold War ended and how that gave the impetus, provided the impetus for the rise of China up to the kind of status that we see today, and then also, unfortunately, to the kind of Sino-American rivalry that we see today. So I'm speaking to you as a very presentist historian. I became an historian because I was interested in figuring out why the world looks the way it does today. I'm interested in the past, deeply interested in the past, but I'm first and foremost interested in the past in terms of how it gave rise to the present. And I think when you're dealing with really very significant issues, such as the origins of the Sino-American rivalry on a global scale, which I think speaking of parents and children, is going to be the predominant facet of our children's lives in terms of the international implications of what is going on today. It is important to try to ground that in an understanding of how it came to be. So that's what I'm going to do today for about, I think about 40 minutes or so, and then we will have a discussion about it afterwards. So in order to understand this, I suggest you have to go back to the 1970s and the transformation that the world went through during that decade. I experienced some of it. I was in my teens in the 1970s. Some of my students say that that's the reason why I'm so preoccupied with the 1970s, is that what you experience when you are in your teens always come back to you later on as more significant than many other things that you experience later. There might be an element of that in it, but I don't think that is the full story. So what happened in the 1970s in terms of what I want to try to explain today was first and foremost a global transformation of how the world economy worked. So coming out of the post-war era, the era after 1945, we had constructed a world that was very clear, very easy to understand, very determined by national measures, by ideas that came from the need for stability, for predictability, after the end of the Great Depression and the end of the Second World War. It was a world in economic terms of fixed interest rates, of fixed currency rates, of export controls, of very powerful governments in terms of the development of the economy nationally and internationally. Often referred to as the Bretton Woods system, that some of you will have heard about. The idea that you had to put what the governments wanted to do, sometimes in unison, sometimes particularly in terms of the United States unilaterally, at the center of international economic interaction. That was the world that was created in the 1940s and lasted roughly up to the early 1970s, when it came down with a crash. And understanding why that happened, I think, is essential for understanding where our world has been heading since. So the end of the Bretton Woods system, it's called the Bretton Woods system because that's where the international economic arrangements in the post-war era were negotiated in 1944 and then briefly in 1945. Not too far from here, as some of you will know. But the significance of this, of the breakdown of that system, was enormous for what was going to happen later on. And the reason why this system of predictability, of certainty, of direction, the reason why it broke down, in my view, is the increasing competition between the main capitalist powers that you saw from the late 1960s onwards. Basically, after the reconstruction of Western Europe and Japan after the Second World War was over. Up to then, the United States had been by far the most significant power in global economic terms. In the late 1940s, the United States had about 50% of the world's GDP. I mean, this was a unique situation, and of course it came about as a result of the war, how the war ended, the fact that there wasn't major warfare in the United States itself, while war was predominant almost everywhere else. It was a unique moment. It couldn't stay like that. But even so, that American predomination lasted for quite a long time. By the late 1960s, no more. Western Europe was on the rise, Japan was on the rise, a number of other powerful competitors to the United States were on the rise. So the old system could not hold anymore. And of course, the American leadership of the time, President Nixon and his advisors, started worrying about this intensely. It was a period in which the United States was still militarily, strategically predominant, but increasingly had trouble creating the kind of economic framework for sustaining those kinds of international engagements. Right? Not entirely unlike our own time, by the way. The war in Vietnam was the most visible aspect of this, but there were a number of other US international engagements that also seemed to be undertaken by a country where both the population, certainly the elites, and the political leadership were in doubt about whether they would have the wherewithal, whether they would have the economic power to underwrite these kinds of engagements. Or even, what would be worse, underwrite the global US engagement in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So how could the United States at the same time carry the weight of fighting the Cold War on a global scale while it had to face within its own part of the world, within its own economic system, increasingly powerful competitors that were competing against the United States very often successfully in international terms, Western Europe, Japan, and others. So the solution that the Nixon administration found to this was to abandon the Bretton Woods system and move towards a system that was much more open, that was much more dependent on what the United States wanted to do in terms of the international economy. I hesitate to call it America First, but there was an America First element in it. In reality, what they undertook was a massive devaluation of the American dollar against other currencies in order to facilitate the ability for the United States to compete internationally. So in preparing this talk, I was thinking many times about whether they actually knew what they were doing. I mean, they knew what they were doing in terms of improving the international circumstances for the United States to compete economically in the world. They certainly understood that. I think what they didn't understand, or at least didn't understand as clearly, was that by abolishing many of these controls that had existed all the way back to the 1940s, they created a new world in economic and financial terms, a world that we live in, still live in today, that was dramatically different from what we had seen during that period. A massive global expansion of capital that could move much more freely than what had been the case before, especially financial capital, when the various controls and restrictions were abolished. I don't think that was clearly seen in the early 1970s. By the late 1970s, it was pretty obvious that the effect of this was what we later on came to call globalization, right? That capital, including to a very large extent American capital, spread on a global scale. The United States economy went international in a way that it had never done before. So as late as the early 1970s, most of American economic and financial activity was pointing inward. Right? After this, it points outward, as does almost all other advanced capitalist countries in terms of their economic activity. I don't think the Nixon administration foresaw that. But the United States still became, to quite some extent, at least in the short term, the beneficiary of that opening up. Many of you here, I think, will remember the 1970s, right? So a period that started up, in this country certainly, with a deep sense of weakness, right? Of a set of economic problems, in terms of currency crisis, the energy crisis of 1973, and then again in 1977, 1978. I mean, this deep sense of American weakness in the world. But then when you get to the late 70s and early 1980s, all of this seems to have been transformed. Transformed in a direction that served American purposes much, much, much better. And I would argue tonight that a significant part of the reason why that happened was this globalization of capital that took place during the 1970s, which probably was, for the most part, unintended. That's how history works sometimes, right? It is not what you necessarily set out to do that delivers the results that you can afterwards, in this case in the Reagan era, bask in the glory of, right? It is rather something that comes out, at least in part, of unintended consequences, consequences that have not been put in motion, certainly not at the government level, of the kind of policies that you wanted to develop. And this is where China comes into it, big style. So China, as most of you will know, after the Communist Revolution in the late 1940s, had been, for the most part, a poor and terrorized country. What the Chinese communists did when they took power, in part because they were so preoccupied with the effects of the long period going before that of foreign predomination and foreign wars, was to create a China that entirely turned inward. It was allied for a while with the Soviet Union, but that didn't last very long either. What Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Communist Party, and those who worked most closely with him wanted to do, was to create a China that was strong, but created from the inside. Created not by engaging with the world, but by cutting it off from the world. As Mao liked to say, put your own house in order first, and then see if you can turn towards the world. So by the time that these changes are taking place at an international level, it's pretty clear that that inward-looking form of Chinese development had come to a dead end. I mean, through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and all of these things that you will have heard about. So, you know, communist utopian plans that in economic and social terms led absolutely nowhere. And a lot of people, particularly younger people in China in the early 1970s, were looking for a way out of this. Were looking for a way in which they could probably practice what they believed in politically, but also make the country rich and strong. The original promise of the Chinese Revolution in the early 20th century. So this was the basis for what happens in parallel to the economic development that I have talked about. The remarkable coming together of the United States and China in strategic terms in the early 1970s. Now, it's important to be aware that these are parallel, to begin with, parallel, but not necessarily interlinked processes. So the main reason why President Nixon and Chairman Mao did what they did in the early 1970s in opening a epoch-making rapprochement between the United States and China were security concerns, not economic or developmental concerns. Right? They were both afraid about what was seen as the rising power of the Soviet Union in international affairs, for very different reasons, it should be said. Chinese had had a falling out with the Soviets in the early 1960s. For the United States, the Soviet Union had always been the major rival, the other superpower in the Cold War. So at some point for the two to at least have some kind of relationship, Communist China and the United States, was, if not self-evident, at least it was something that was, you know, that was pointed in the direction of, I would say, from the early 1960s on, when Mao broke entirely with the Soviets. What set it off was security-oriented, was a set of security crises, a war scare in Beijing in 1969, where the Chinese leadership believed that they would actually be attacked by the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons pretty soon. And Nixon's ability, some of the same ability that he showed in being able to at least move, not always in directions he understood, on the deteriorating US economic situation, in reaching out to the Chinese for strategic reasons. So This was the basis for the development of a new US-China relationship. What then happened was that these two processes that I've talked about now converged after Mao died in 1976 and after the military coup, as I like to call it, a month after the chairman died, where the Chinese left was excluded from power in the Communist Party, the Cultural Revolution left were arrested, excluded, and Deng Xiaoping and the people who worked with him came to power. They had a very different vision for China's future, in which they thought it would be possible to link into these global developments that I have just been talking about. That it wasn't just about security, but that there was this opportunity of taking, let's use the globalization shorthand for it, early globalization. The enormous expansion of capital on a global scale, to make use of that in order to make China rich. So they are the ones that start setting up the special economic zones in parts of China, inviting American and other foreign companies to come in, set up businesses in China, benefit from low wages in the People's Republic, being able to export from these zones, but also, of course, to encourage Chinese to develop their own businesses and their own economic foundations in ways that would have been unthinkable only a few years before. So this is a time when I first arrived in China myself in 1979 as an exchange student at Peking University. So I got to see some of this from the inside. And it was a truly remarkable development. So when I first arrived, you had to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. No undergraduate wants to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. Not even 8 o'clock in the morning. But we had to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning to shout, "Long live Mao Zedong," and these kinds of slogans, you know, at the central parade ground of Peking University. A year later, that parade ground no longer existed. It had been transformed into tennis courts. And the slogans were gone. You know, now if you shouted slogans at all, it was about making China rich and strong, and to get rich is glorious. Those kinds of slogans. Very different from what I'd seen at the beginning of the year. That's how quickly the transformation took place in China. And it took place for a reason. I mean, Chinese people were sick and tired of being poor and terrorized by their own government. Now they had the opportunity to do things that they were never able to do before, and they grabbed it. Right? They made use of that opportunity. So what had started for the United States as an outreach to China in an attempt to stabilize the Cold War, to get out of Vietnam, to have a better ability to compete with the Soviet Union, had turned in after the 1976 coup to an opportunity for China to go international. In a little way, much less significant way than the United States, to do the same thing that the United States had done only a few years earlier, to internationalize and then reap the benefits of doing that. And this is the background for what I describe, as Lars said, in my newest book, co-written with my colleague and friend, Professor Chen Jian, about China's transformation in what you could call the long 1970s, which to me still is the most remarkable transformation that we have seen probably for the last 200 years. The breakthrough of markets in Britain and in this country were quite remarkable, but they still pale in comparison to what happened in China in the late 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. In part because the population was far bigger in China when this took place, but also because of the Chinese starting point. You know, you could argue to some extent that back in the 19th century, first in Britain and then in the United States, these societies had pointed in the direction of a market revolution. And then it happens, right? China had not pointed in the direction of a market revolution. It had pointed away from it, right? That was Mao's message to the Chinese communists, to break away from capitalism, to create a non-capitalist, an anti-capitalist society. And then things turned. And then the transformation happened in less than a generation, where you get this remarkable creation of a Chinese middle class, which already in the early 2000s, in terms of their buying power, was probably bigger than the European middle class. I mean, something like 450 million people who were able to consume roughly at the same level as the EU average back then. That's a remarkable transformation in terms of how quickly it happened. And I think, I mean, certainly for me in my experience, but I think in a broader sense as well, this is the great story of our time, right? How this happened and the scale on which it happened. The scale is, of course, massively important here. But this also led to something else. China's transformation led to a skewing of the ideological competition in the Cold War. So if China, communist China, which had been the most fundamental critic of capitalist forms of development in the West and everywhere else in the first part of the 20th century, if they could now turn entirely to the other side and say that markets are good, markets are what is going to get you ahead in the world, when then the room of maneuver for the Soviet Union and what it stood for started to shrink, and shrink very, very dramatically. I mean, I saw this, I was doing a lot of work in Africa in the early 1980s, and you could see this happening, right? Where newly liberated, newly colonized countries who had chosen a sort of, broadly speaking, socialist path of development were looking at China and then starting to wonder, have we come down on the right side of history? You know, in terms of what we want to do, is the concentration on the state and on central planning really the direction you want to go in? And increasingly, the answer to that was no. So some of the air was taken out of the initially Soviet project of state-led development at this point, not just in the Soviet Union itself, but also elsewhere. And this, in my view, was part of, it's not the full story, so don't get me wrong on this, but it's part of what led to the end of the Cold War and the way the Cold War ended. There are many other things, which I don't have time to go into today, that led to the end of the Cold War. But this wholesale defection of China from a strictly planned regime of economic development, the ability and willingness to use markets, to use private companies or collective companies in order to develop the economy. For a lot of places in the world, in terms of underlining what everyone wants to get, right, the direction that history is taking, this was really, really significant. And it was very hard for the Soviets to compete with, particularly because their own economic results were not all that great. Right? Even if you compare to the West, never mind China and other industrializing countries in Eastern Asia. So even though I think one has to be careful with arguing that this is what led to the end of the Cold War, I think it's incredibly important to understand that it was part of what pushed in that direction, what made the room for maneuver for the Soviet Union so much narrower when Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union in 1985. And Gorbachev himself sees that almost immediately in terms of trying to carry out reform, which then fails. And that, to me, is probably what, more than anything else, leads to the end of the Cold War. So China went through a lot of both developmental and political challenges during the 1980s, culminating, as many of you here will know, with the events of 1989, the Communist Party's crackdown on the democracy movement in Beijing and elsewhere. We lived in China that year, so again, I got to see this from the inside. And it was very, very bad. And not surprising. I mean, I don't think a regime like the Chinese Communist Party regime that had gotten to power the way it did, that had practiced power in the way that I saw it since the late 1970s. The idea that they would give up power voluntarily to a bunch of unarmed students who sat down in Tiananmen Square was not something that I believed in. And I tried talking to my Chinese students and others about this. Their view was different. But the end result was immensely tragic. What's interesting about it, though, for our purposes here, is that much of the cooperation that had been created between the United States and China in economic terms continued after 1989. There might have been a brief hiatus in the early 1990s, right, when sanctions and all of that imposed because of the Tiananmen massacre and the crackdown on Democrats in China. But broadly speaking, the cooperation continued. And here I think is an important, really important point to make in terms of today's situation between the United States and China. The United States didn't promote China as an international partner in economic terms, primarily for China's sake. It did so during the Clinton administration and during the George W. Bush administration, at least the first part thereof, because of a very strong belief that bringing China into the international market system, also in terms of its rules and regulations, such as in the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, would also serve American interests. The Cold War was over. Liberal, market-oriented democracies seem to have won the day. The postulation of this, often used, as many of you will know, is Francis Fukuyama's end of history. Sometimes misunderstood, but for this purpose, I think quite striking. History in terms of competition between capitalism and socialism had ended. Capitalism and capitalist markets were the world. They were the future. That was unavoidable. That was the direction that things were taking. And therefore, for the United States to facilitate, to shape the entry of the most powerful country in the world in terms of future economic prospects, China, into a liberal international economic order, that was something that was strongly in the American interest. We can see that argument. We can talk about it later. Some people today are saying they got this all wrong. They misunderstood it. They gave an opportunity to China, for China to rise, which then would be to the detriment of the United States. But that was not the way things were seen at the time. This was seen in a direct sense as being in America's interest, at least as much as being in China's interest. Globalization would lift all boats and do that roughly at the same time. So this was working well as long as it worked, right? And it worked for about a generation. And here I'm not just thinking about China's rise and the relationship between the United States and China, but also what was created by this massive deregulation, massive liberalization, and expansion of capital on a global scale. But it couldn't last forever. So by the late 2000s, it seems to me, based on what many good young historians, particularly financial historians, are working on today, that the whole system was in increasing difficulties, increasing trouble. And the reason for that was primarily that it was based on allocations of economic power that in the longer term would be very, very problematic. if, again, and I say this with a deliberate exaggeration, if you had this extraordinary expansion of consumption in the West, in the United States, and to some extent in Europe, at the same time as you had an industrial and financial expansion in the East, not just in China, but in Eastern Asia overall, it's clear that the system at some point would start to get into trouble, right? With extreme levels of indebtedness, as we saw in 2008, 2009 in the financial crisis, but also in terms of a system of finance and production that didn't really go well together. Right? And my view is that we have suffered from that imbalance ever since. I think what we are seeing now is not just the after effects of that economic discrepancy, the original disturbance played down a decade later. I think it's also based on some of the extraordinary imbalances created by globalization and the expansion of financial capitalism that were left unresolved even after the great financial crisis of the late 2000s. Be that as it may, and it coincided with a time when America's unipolar moment, the period of American control of the global system after the Cold War ended, seemed to be slipping. Now, very often this is today, and I think for some time, symbolized by the failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. My view is that those are more a symptom than a cause of what actually went on. I think the real parallel here is in a almost ironic kind of way, more with what happened in the 1970s, that other countries were catching up. But in this case, these countries were not just the liberal capitalist competitors that existed within the system that was created by the outcome of the Second World War. They also included blatantly illiberal countries such as China, right? Which made for the direction which I think the world is turning in now, which is away from unipolarity, I think that's pretty clear, but not necessarily towards some kind of bipolarity between China and the United States. I think where we are heading is a much more messy, think about the war in Ukraine, much more messy international terrain, a multipolar world that I think no one who is here in this audience have seen in their own lifetime, right? Something that is much more reminiscent to me as a comparative historian to the late 19th century or the early 20th century before the First World War than anything that we have seen since then. We can talk more about this after the talk. And at the same time, you know, clearly within that international system, among the rising powers, China is probably the one that is rising the most. And it's rising certainly most visibly, while continuing to practice a very illiberal approach to internal governance. Now, my view of the latter point is that I never seen during these 30 years of Chinese market-based economic expansion any intention on the side of the Chinese Communist Party to liberalize politically. I think, you know, there have been people outside of China, there have been some people inside of China as well, who have believed that that would be a necessary end product of China's dynamic market-based economic transformation. I've never been among those. I think it's perfectly possible to practice one-party dictatorship, even a strengthening dictatorship as we see now under Xi Jinping, with forms of liberal economics. And China, in a way, has proven that is possible, at least up to now, where I think for internal political reasons, at least parts of the Chinese economy is turning increasingly statist. But for a very long time, that balance was actually kept. The CCP was in charge of this economic transformation, fully and throughout. We can discuss afterwards the degree to which some of the changes were unintentional, which ones of them were deliberate, But there was never any sense, there was never any intention for the Chinese communists to give up political power in the way that I think some people in the West foresaw as a result of economic reform. So now we are in a situation where there is increasing tension between the United States and China. In my view, this was created by developments that took place on both sides. It's not possible to understand how the United States and China went from almost a generation of working fairly closely together, in some areas, strategic areas, very closely together, back in the 1980s, for instance, under Ronald Reagan's presidency, without understanding it on both sides. I think what was pushed in the direction of more conflict is an increasing, particularly post late 2000s financial crisis, US sense of weakness and decline, which of course you can see most immediately played out in American politics and the divisions that exist in American politics today. But also on the Chinese side of the Chinese Communist Party's increasing sense of the United States being a threat to its own power within China. What you heard in the most recent party congress finished just a few days ago about the Chinese communist leadership thinking that the United States is out to subvert and eventually overthrow the kind of regime that they have put in place in China. This is not just rhetoric. I think based on American behavior since the early 2000s, this is something that many Chinese communist leaders believe in very firmly. And it's very problematic, I think, for where we move in this relationship in the future. The significance of it, of that worldview, is exacerbated, in my view, by the current Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping's leadership group, believing that the world is increasingly turning in their direction. That the tremendous success that China has had over the last generation and a half prepares it, postulates that China in the future is going to move to a much more significant position, first and foremost within its own region, within the Eastern Asian region, but probably over a longer period of time, also globally. The world seems to them to be turning in their direction. At the same time as many of them, including at least a couple of people very recently elected to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, believing very firmly that the United States is in decline and that the West is weak. Not a good combination in terms of, for those of us who want to think about stability in the world going forward. But at the same time, I think it's important to underline that the kind of conclusions that the current Chinese leadership have drawn from what has happened over the past generation is first and foremost about China's leadership role within Eastern Asia. So I often feel that on the American side, maybe particularly in Washington right now, over the last few months, that there is this sense that the CCP and China is a global challenge to American interests. Now, it might end up there. We don't know. But I don't think that's the situation at the moment, and I'm not even sure that that's where the current CCP leadership want to go. Now, you could counter that argument, some of you may want to do this in the discussion afterwards, by saying it doesn't matter all that much, because if today you control or predominate in Eastern Asia, which is where almost all of the world's economic growth is going to be over the next generation, then you pretty much predominate on a global scale, just like people would say in the early 20th century, if you control Europe, well, then you control the world, right? So I see that argument. But that's not the same thing as saying necessarily that China is going to move from that position over onto trying to do the same thing as the Soviet Union blatantly did, which is to export its political and social system to the rest of the world. I don't see much evidence, in spite of the increasing authoritarianism that we now see in Chinese politics, of that happening. So where that leaves us, and I'll end by this, is in a situation where I don't think it makes much sense to talk about the return to the Cold War. I mean, this is not a Cold War. The world is becoming more multipolar, not more bipolar, right? There are other powers, as you see over the last few months, that also have the ability to act autonomously in the world. Think Russia, think India, think others, in a way that would have been unthinkable under Cold War conditions, right? But that's not necessarily good news, unfortunately. Because the Cold War, after all, was a period of relative stability in an international sense. It was, as Lars said, in terms of my own work, part of what I've been able to show is how bloody it was in many parts of the world. But it didn't end in a global conflagration, right? In the way that the First World War or the Second World War did. Now we are in very different territory, because we do not have that kind of stability that a bipolar system, in most cases, imposes on the world or imposes on a region in historical terms. It seems to me that we're rather into a much more messy, much more complex situation in which both countries, both the United States and China, have to show extraordinary discipline to avoid a hot war, a direct confrontation between the two sides on issues such as Korea, on Taiwan, on the South China Sea, on a number of other issues that are existing within the region that we are looking at. So that's where I want to leave it tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I just try to give you an overview of some of the connections that I see as being significant in terms of understanding this development. But at the same time, of course, being very careful, as any historian should, in trying to predict what the future would actually bring coming out of this. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. We have some time for Q&A. There are 2 microphones set up, one here and one there. If you'd like to speak, just please come on up, ask your question. Professor Westad covered a lot of ground and left us with plenty of food for thought. So I'm sure you have questions. We've got a lot of time. Please don't be shy.
I hope I haven't completely overwhelmed you or scared you so stiff that you're incapable of action. Yes, please.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. It was great. The most fascinating player to me in this is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. And what I kept on wondering as you talked about this sudden transition from state-planned economy to a market economy is how the ruling elite kept together in this context. And I'm not sure if this is something that historians of modern China have discussed a great deal, but I'd like to hear why there weren't the fractures that drove other political parties or institutions apart in the CCP, how it maintained itself as an institution through these massive changes. Weren't there pushbacks from different institutions, different groups? What gives it the continuity and the strength?
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good question. It's one that I've been wondering about myself. I mean, I'm surprised that it was possible to keep the party together, particularly after 1989, the way that it ended up being. I think there are 2, possibly 3, main reasons for it. The first one is a party leadership under Deng Xiaoping that was remarkably intact for a long period of time. It's hard to say exactly how long. I mean, by the early 1990s, it's pretty clear that Deng himself was flagging. But he was still around. I mean, even after 1989, he could make sure to lay down the law on what the broader parts of development would be. So some of you will know this. So after the 1989 crackdown on the democracy movement, what Deng does is that he goes to the south, he goes to the central areas of market-based economic development, and he lays down the law. He says, he repeats his phrase from earlier on, to get rich is glorious. He says that cracking down on political liberalism is not the same thing as stifling market-based economic development. And he makes it an article of faith for the party to be willing to practice liberal economics at the same time as it persecutes people who want to see moves towards democracy and towards political pluralism. So I think that's the first reason why it was possible to keep this together. It became more difficult later on in many ways, and I think that's the reason why we now see the Xi Jinping phenomenon, which is much cruder in many ways than what Deng and his leadership group was capable of. The second one is trickier, because it has to do with how the Chinese socialist state was dismantled. So many of you will know about this from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, right? How there was a sort of massive kleptocracy that basically took over what had been communal property and supercharged it for their own purposes within a private ownership structure, right? So basically private confiscations of public property, right? Now, exactly the same thing happened in China, but it happened in a different format. And the format here was that many of the people who were allowed to, were able to take over this collective property, were still beholden to the party for their ability to do so. You could, if you want to use a loaded term, you could say that China took corruption to a completely different level than what you had seen before. And this, I think, fooled, I mean, I would never say a bad word about economists, but there were a few people who worked on understanding the structural changes in the Chinese economy who just didn't get this. They thought they saw real market-based liberal economic reform that empowered people through hard work and whatnot, you know, to get ahead. While in reality, you saw exactly the same confiscation of public property for private interest, only that it was done in a much more regulated and state-led format or scenario, right? So you then ended up with this remarkable situation in which you had, at least in name, private companies that were inherently beholden to the Chinese Communist Party's leadership for the kind of position that they had got. That, I think, played a really important role. And the third aspect, less important than the two first ones, I think, is the Chinese Communist Party's remarkable ability, which it has shown throughout its 100-year existence, to tell different kinds of stories, to have different kinds of narratives to different groups, right? And if you compare them to communists in the West or the Soviet communists or whatever, they are very different on this. I mean, they've always been able to come up with these narratives that possibly, in the mind of the central communist leadership, serve the same purpose. I'm not excluding that. I'm not saying that that cannot be possible. But in the way it comes out, you know, they are telling different stories to different groups. They are practicing the sort of different strokes for different folks kind of approach. You know, they send Christmas cards to successful entrepreneurs in Tianjin, coming from an atheist communist party, right? They think that's that's possible, right? They create competitions for Entrepreneur of the Year in Guangdong, you know, someone who had worked his or her way, very often her way, up from very little to become a successful entrepreneur. But at the same time, they made it entirely clear that whatever you do in that sphere, you're not going to have any influence on central policy, which is set by a very limited group, none of whom have their background in business. or in the private sector. Not enough of an explanation, but at least in a direction of what.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful and thought-provoking talk. And my question might be a little bit more inchoate than David's, but I wanted to turn it toward the West. And one of the things that strikes me when you're talking about this, when you're going from Bretton Woods forward, is I'm thinking of the narrative of decline. We had a little bit of this back in the 80s when it seemed like Japan was going to threaten US economic hegemony, and you had a similar rhetoric going on in Western Europe. That came and went. But now things seem very different. And if you read like the work of Robert Gordon, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, or Angus Deaton and Holly Case, with their critique, particularly The Deaths of Despair, if you take their work and you go to places like where you live in Connecticut, and you go to a place like Bridgeport,
Sure.
or you go to Lewiston, Maine, or you go to Youngstown, Ohio, or take the UK, you go to Leeds, you go to Yorkshire, you go to the outside of metropolitan Paris, you go to Milan and the outskirts of there. There's something very different here now with what's happening domestically, and yields death of despair in the United States, and the Yellow Vest protests in France, and Maloney coming to power in Italy. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on that, because that strikes me as someone who lived through the 80s. I'm not going to date myself any further than that, but that there's something qualitatively different about the anxieties around the rise of a Japanese economic power, and then now even that same country is having its similar issues of this disinvestment and the, in some ways the utter, to call it what it is, the utter wreckage of a lot of the working class, and why people in England's north voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. So if you could just kind of, like I said, it's inchoate, but if you could comment a little bit on that, that's sort of that side on the West. Thanks.
Yeah. No, it's a very important, slightly depressing direction to think in, which I think is absolutely necessary, because this is the part that we often don't get when we think about the redistribution of international power, particularly international economic power. We all think about it in terms of the rise of various Asian countries. In Japan, perhaps first, but in Japan, as you said, peaked for various reasons that I think are inherently connected to how the Japanese economy has worked for the past 100 odd years. But that the real story about this, the most important part of the story of it, to me, is this equilibrium that has existed in terms of how Western countries have handled their own social and economic development. To me, this is absolutely clear, that if you don't understand that version of the story, particularly the post-Bretton Woods story that I alluded to in my talk, that the disequilibrium is within our own societies as much as it exists between the West and Asia, or whatever way you want to, the rise of China, or whatever, then you get something fundamentally wrong. You can see the attractiveness in Europe, and especially in this country, of saying the Chinese are taking our jobs. Right? The Chinese are, or East Asians, or whatever. Just like what was said about the Japanese in the 1970s and early 1980s. Right? And that's fundamentally untrue. Right? It's untrue in both directions. It's untrue because what has taken away productive working class jobs in this country is the deliberate deindustrialization that has taken place in the United States. It's very little to do with China. And realizing that, whatever your politics are, realizing that is of immense importance, because this country will not be in a position in the future to compete with China on any issue, including military strategic competition, if it doesn't rebuild the ability of ordinary people in this country, whoever they are, wherever they live, to get decent jobs that pay a decent salary, that are reasonably safe and productive, right? And we have failed dismally, it seems to me, in doing that. And we can explore the reasons why that is so. Some of it is connected to the story that I told about how financial capital came to predominate on a global scale. There are other reasons. I mean, you pointed out quite correctly. I see this every day in New Haven. Right? And they are more connected to particular parts of industry. They are connected to the relationship between the working class and capital investments of various sorts. There are many reasons for it, but it is still a fundamental part of this problem. And my biggest, I mean, probably in overall terms, my biggest fear in terms of the future is that we will not realize that soon enough, so that we, in a way, when the Chinese-American competition and confrontation intensifies, as I think it will, that we will increasingly point in the direction of our problems being their fault at all scales, at all levels. And again, I mean, whatever your politics are, I mean, if you think that this country should move in the direction of increased liberalization, of moving away from any kind of controls on capital, whatever it is, or you think that there should be more government-led incentives to get people into meaningful work, it doesn't really matter all that much. The matter is that we create a policy in which it is possible to return to some kind of productive capacity for the majority of people who live in this country, which we don't have at the moment. So, you know, this might sound more US political really than it is about the US-China competition, but to me it is really, really essential. And it's a really essential part if you want to think about this strategically as well. At the beginning of the Cold War, George Kennan warned against this. I mean, he said that, and quite correctly, that the one thing that would defeat the United States in the Cold War was if it wasn't able to deal with its internal contradictions, and particularly the dissatisfaction among people who were among the have-nots coming out, in that case, of the Great Depression within American society. That was the greatest strategic danger that the United States faced. Right? And he was entirely right about that. It was the resolution of some of those problems within global market-based societies in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s that prepared the tremendous success that these societies had towards the end of the Cold War. Without it, the Cold War wouldn't have ended the way it did. So Kennan was right about that, and I'm worried that we don't see that clearly enough today.
I greatly appreciate your talk, and I thought it was quite interesting. But I think that you're undercounting something that's quite fundamental, in that our economy is free, open. The Chinese economy is hardly that. We were hoping it would be back in the 80s with Bill Clinton, and with a free, treating them as a world economic power, as a favored nation. But what that did is open up our doors to them for our trademarks, our industry, innovation, and they are competing as a government economy to a free economy. The advent of low prices of anything at Walmart, you will never find, up until the last few years, US-made products. That is translated to keeping the pricing in America very low, which took away all the bargaining power of labor in places that were mentioned by the previous questionnaire. And it's not a lack of interest of those industries, it's that they had no pricing power, period, for a period of almost 20 years now. It's really serious, and the only thing that's coming back is if we fight against that openness that we have in our country against what they have as a closed economy. If you're going to open up a business in China, you give up all of your secrets, all your technology, and 51%. That's not quite the way it's worked here. So I think that you're missing the impact of that imbalance. Thank you.
So the big question, I mean, I don't disagree with your analysis of what has been going on. We probably have a difference in terms of emphasis. But in overall terms, certainly in terms of outcome, I don't think we disagree at all. The big question is, how do we deal with that? And this is on this I do see an echo of the Cold War, in a way. So the big question to me then is, if your analysis is correct, that these two economies are, in terms of the central aspects of their direction, fundamentally different. We are a free economy, and they are a state-led, a government-led, certainly in terms of direction, economy. What do we do about that, right? Because the one thing we don't want to do, I assume most people don't want to do in this country, is to make this country into a more state-led economy. You know, I mean, you could argue, I would argue, that we need more of an industrial policy than what we have at the moment. I remember a few years ago in Washington, I was talking about during a very different administration from the one we have now. It wasn't the Trump administration, it was well before the Trump administration. And people were saying, industrial policy? How can you mention an industrial policy? You know, that's so 1970s or 1980s. We can't do that now. Of course we have to think about an industrial policy, because that's the way the countries that we are competing against actually think. I mean, not just China, but a whole range of them, including countries in Europe, are thinking about it, right? But we don't want necessarily to take this in a direction where we start behaving in the same way as China does, with massive industrial espionage, with closing off much of the markets to effective, as you said, and I think it's entirely correct, foreign investment. So we have to find another way of competing. And that's where I think that much of the recipe that this country developed during the initial post-war era, the first post-war generation, where there was a kind of social bargain, that the big, powerful, productive, innovative companies delivered well-paying jobs for people who were able and willing to work for a living, provided a kind of training, not necessarily, sorry to say this as a college, training at the college level, but a kind of apprenticeships that people would need to get into well-paying jobs, right? And to get into well-paying jobs quite easily. I'm sure some of your parents or grandparents went through, certainly my parents went through exactly that development in the post-war years, from massive poverty during the Great Depression and over onto some hope that you could get a well-paying job by investing in your own betterment. I think that's what we need to do. Because we don't, I mean, you know, just like we didn't want to become the Soviet Union during the Cold War in order to compete with the Soviet Union, I think the vast majority of people in this country do not want to replicate what China has been going through, certainly not over the past decade, in order to compete better with China. So we have to find the solution that actually fits the kind of framework that this country wants to stand for. And that, to me, means that one has to get rid of some of the imbalances that have developed in the economy since the period really that I started talking about in my description of things here. But I mean, let me underline that I do not for a moment deny what you stressed in terms of the unfair advantages that have come out of the way that the Chinese Communist Party has practiced the development of its economy over the past generation. Not at all. The question is, how do we deal with it?
This is probably an unfair question for an historian, but I'm wondering...
Is it about the future?
It is, or at least the present. I'm wondering, I'm a little unclear what your prescriptions for American foreign policy toward the Chinese should be. For example, I'm interested to know what you think about the trade agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration, which was ultimately defeated. But
you mean the TCP, the trans?
I'd forgotten the alphabet actually. But yeah. So I'll let you answer.
So I think that it's very interesting, this, because things are moving so quickly now in the US-China relationship that I find myself on alternate weeks being regarded as a hawk and a dove in terms of the US relationship to China. Whenever, for instance, Taiwan comes up, I'm regarded as a dove because I think that it's in both countries' interest to avoid a conflict over Taiwan. I don't think that makes me a dove, but I mean, that's the sort of sense, the way things are turning now in Washington. Other people would regard me as a hawk in the sense that I think that it's really, really important that the United States stands up for its friends and allies in Eastern Asia, particularly those who come under increasing Chinese pressure, such as the countries in Southeast Asia with regard to the South China Sea. And I believe that we should do more, not less, in order to enable countries all the way from Vietnam to Burma to defend themselves. And I really mean defend themselves, not just in a political term, but in strategic military terms as well, against increasing Chinese pressure. And that's when they call me a hawk. So, I mean, I guess you can be both in a way. I mean, it would be a strange kind of bird. But, I think, so on trade, I'm probably more on the dovish side. I mean, I'm in favor of trade, going back to the last question, under conditions that are fully equal. Right? The WTO agreement that China entered into in 2002, with the amendments, is a reasonably equal form of trade agreement. The problem is not that China has sinned dramatically against the WTO order. The United States has about 5 times as many complaints in terms of its international trade behavior within the WTO regime as China has against it. The problem is what China does on the side of that agreement, such as industrial espionage on a vast scale, very often underestimated in this country until very recently. In my view, one of the few things that the Trump administration got right on this was in emphasizing that as a threat. And it is a threat. Not just to the United States, it's a threat to the world. And this is government-driven in China, and it's engaged in on a scale that, I mean, this happens in most countries, but in terms of the scale, other countries are vastly inferior to what China is undertaking. So we have to crack down on that. We have to make that more difficult. We also have to make sure, and this is where the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the defeated, or at least for the US defeated plan of setting up a Trans-Pacific free market area comes into it. We have to make sure that the United States has arrangements in terms of trade with other partners except China that provides the best possible opportunities, not just for American business, but also for these foreign businesses, particularly in Southeast Asia, which is going to be the most significant area in the world in terms of economic expansion, in my view, over the next generation. That we can sustain those easily over a long period of time. I think it was a terrible mistake to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think it's probably, I think the Biden administration is probably right in concluding that it's too late now to do something specifically about that, but I do hope that if they are reelected, or whoever the next administration is, will realize that it is vastly in America's strategic interest to set up some kind of free market, Trans-Pacific free market framework that will be based on the interests of the United States and its partners in Eastern Asia, that China can then decide whether it wants to adhere to or not, right? If it adheres to it, I think that will be fine, as long as it will be drawn up on the basis of the same principles that were actually embedded, not least labor principles that were embedded, and environmental principles that were embedded in the failed Trans-Pacific Partnership engagement. So you can trade with China without being put at a massive strategic disadvantage. You just have to make sure that you are more self-conscious in how it is actually done. And you have to be willing to crack down. Even, and this is a mistake I think we made. I mean, Europeans made the same mistake. Much more openly, much more visibly, much more confrontationally when China circumvents, when Chinese institutions, state institutions, circumvent the kind of framework that has been set up for a proper trade relationship and a proper economic partnership. Now, I accept what some people are saying, that we may then end up with trade as well as other relations with China going downhill. But that's a risk we have to be willing to take, right? Because this relationship is not necessarily going ahead at full tilt in economic terms as it strategically gets into trouble. We have to recognize that. While at the same time, we want to be as open as possible in making sure that not all aspects of US-China relations go downhill at the same time.
Thank you so much for your talk. I do agree that it seems like we're moving towards multipolarity. I was wondering within this, could you speak to China's investment in Africa and that relationship and where that fits in? Thanks.
Thank you. So this is something I've been quite interested in for some time, and I think, I mean, to be brief about this because we're getting to the end of the session, I think for most African countries, having Chinese companies as an alternative to Western companies is probably a good thing. The West does not have a particularly good record in setting up equitable and interactive trade arrangements or capital investment arrangements with African countries. So the kind of competition that Chinese companies come up with is probably pretty good. But it depends entirely on how African countries are able to handle their own sovereignty with regard to issues of Chinese investment. And that's what I worry about. So overall, in Africa, up to now, with some exceptions, this has been a story where African sovereignty trumps Chinese capital. I mean, sovereignty has been more important. The ability to say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, or indeed, if need be, to say that in terms of credit, in terms of loans, can't pay, won't pay. You know, just as in many cases in Africa, African leaders have a really good track record of putting their own social and economic development before necessarily repaying Western financial institutions in the way that they want to see fit. The problem is that there are some countries in Africa, a small number, increasingly, that do not have that ability to handle their own sovereignty or to handle their own economic development in a more positive direction. And that's where Chinese investment and Chinese business methods can turn rather toxic. Right? I won't use too many examples here, but there are, and I've seen some of these up close, there are examples in Africa of where Chinese companies move in and more or less take over a whole sector of the economy and make use of it for their own purposes without much attention being paid to local standards in terms of labor, in terms of wages, in terms of safety, in terms of environmental concerns. There are quite a number of these in some African countries. So my conclusion to this is that what is needed is not less Chinese investment in Africa. What is needed is strengthening the ability of those relatively few African countries that are not able to deal with this in the way of saying this is where you get off. This is where you can't continue to develop this in the same direction, as they indeed have done with American and European companies for quite a long time. It's a big question, which I often discuss with African friends and colleagues, what kind of role that the West and the United States can play in improving capacity within African countries to actually do that. There is as many of you will know, there is an enormous suspicion by many Africans for really good reasons, saying, you know, why are the Americans, why are the Westerners constantly harping on about this? Is it simply because they want more advantages for themselves? It's a tough job to convince Africans, given the colonial heritage and everything that's happened since, that Westerners are necessarily there for their own good and trying to enhance their capacity of governance and good economic practices. It's not the same thing that we shouldn't try in an equitable kind of manner, but I think we have to realize that there are those disadvantages, right? I mean, there are those problems. At the same time as we should be, and I certainly will be, very vocal in criticizing Chinese practices when they do not live up to standards that I want to see practiced here, or in Europe, or in other countries. So it is a mixed bag, but I think in overall terms, we should listen more to what the Africans themselves have to say on this. And I think we should be slightly less concerned about this in a sort of broad strategic term, because it's different from what we see in Eastern Asia, and it's different from what we see in the bilateral relations between the two countries.
Okay, there is so much more that could be said. Fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, we are at time. So I just want to thank you again for taking the time to come out tonight. And also, please join me again in thanking Arne Westad for making it up here to Bowdoin to share his research with us. Thank you.
Thank you.